Hello and thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report on NTD Television. I'm your host, Steve Lance. Here's a look at some of the stories we've been following for you today. The Biden administration will make high-quality masks and more tests free for Americans amid surging cases and record hospitalizations. The Supreme Court today blocked Biden's vaccine mandate for large businesses, but the court is allowing the mandate to stand for healthcare workers. Americans are paying at least 7% more for common items, from groceries to used cars. We speak to a leading economist to find out if inflation has peaked or if there is still more to come. The Supreme Court today blocked a vaccine mandate for large businesses. The Supreme Court ruling prevents the Biden administration from requiring that employees at large companies get vaccinated against the CCP virus or undergo weekly testing and wear a mask on the job. At the same time, the court is allowing the administration to proceed with a vaccine mandate for most healthcare workers in the United States. The Biden administration announced Thursday it will make high-quality masks free for Americans. The administration is also doubling its order of at-home COVID tests, with plans to make 1 billion test kits free for Americans.
But I know that for some Americans, a mask is not always affordable or convenient to get. So, next week we'll announce how we are making high-quality masks available to the American people for free.
Biden also said the administration will roll out a website next week where Americans can order the free test kits and have them shipped to their homes. The U.S. is still dealing with a spike in COVID cases brought on by the Omicron variant. COVID hospitalizations in the U.S. reached a record high of over 150,000 on Wednesday. 19 states have less than 15% remaining capacity in their ICUs. Biden also announced help is on the way. His administration is deploying more than 120 military medical personnel to 6 hard-hit states. And Senate Democrats faced a tough question today. Are they more committed to loyalty to President Biden or to cracking down on Russia as troops hover over the Ukraine border? NTD's Melina Wisecup has updates for us.
Well, Steve, this vote is going to be a close call, and as of 5:30 tonight, we're still waiting on those results to come in. We got caught up with Senator Ted Cruz, the author of this bill, earlier today, and he says he's worried that if the Senate doesn't pass this bill, it could send a message of weakness to Putin and embolden him to further encroach on Ukraine.
I believe it substantially increases the odds of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, of in just weeks or months, the possibility of our seeing Russian tanks in the streets of Kiev. The reason Putin has not invaded Ukraine entirely to date is because Putin needs the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Right now, Putin sends his natural gas through Ukraine to get to Europe. If Nord Stream 2 goes online, it goes around Ukraine, and he can march the troops in, he can drive the tanks in.
President Biden single-handedly waived these sanctions in May with the goal to mend relations with Germany, a decision that even Democrats were critical of at the time. But the White House this week rallied Democrats to get back in line. One argument against the bill is that it would do more harm than good, harming U.S.-Germany relations. What would you say to the argument that this bill would hurt U.S.-Germany relations?
Well, if you look at where Europe is, the government of Ukraine has repeatedly pleaded with the United States Senate to pass these sanctions. The Prime Minister of Ukraine, the President of Ukraine have both explicitly said, pass the Nord Stream 2 sanctions now to protect them from a vital threat of invasion. Poland, likewise, the government of Poland is begging the Senate to pass these sanctions. You know, the European Parliament voted on Nord Stream 2. The vote was 585 to 50. 585 to condemn, to stop the Nord Stream 2, to just 50. And so the Biden White House has a talking point. They say we should have transatlantic unity, but they're arguing that we should stand with the 50 against the 585. That doesn't make any sense.
Democrats who voted down Cruz's bill spoke on the floor in agreement of the need to hold Russia accountable for their troop buildup on the Ukraine border. But Biden urged Democrats to oppose Cruz's bill and instead rally behind a competing bill across the aisle from Senator Bob Menendez. Menendez's bill would uphold Biden's strategy to sanction Russia only if the troops invade. And White House officials wrapped up talks with Russian officials, but yet again, those talks didn't yield any major breakthroughs. And one U.S. official involved with those talks says that we should be taking the escalation from Russian troops seriously because he says the drumbeat of war is sounding loud. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
And President Biden made his way to Capitol Hill today to push Democrats on voting rights reform. The House today passed another voting rights package in an effort to fast-track the process in the Senate. But with the Senate filibuster drama still not resolved, it raises the question of what exactly Democrats are trying to do here. Schumer is still committed to bringing this to the floor, even though it's up against a brick wall. The U.S. Producer Price Index rose by 9.7% in 2021, according to a Labor Department report released on Thursday. This increase, measuring wholesale prices for goods and services, is another indicator that inflation will continue. On Wednesday, the Labor Department released a report showing inflation hit its largest spike in 40 years, with a big jump in consumer prices. Some reports suggest inflation may affect Democrats in future elections. House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy lays blame on President Biden. On Thursday, he said this.
We have the highest inflation rate in 40 years, causing prices to surge. That increase you see there all happened under President Biden's watch.
Inflation is polling as a top concern for the American people as we pay more than ever for basic items. We're happy to have one of the country's smartest economists here to discuss with us. Bob Janetsky, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Now, Bob, obviously we've seen that inflation is nearing 39-year highs. It's risen 7%. Has inflation peaked in your perspective?
I don't believe it has. We've seen this 7% rate, and that could be the high, at least for the moment. You know, we've got some good news today with the Producer Price Index falling in the month of December. That's a good sign. It means that some of the supply pressures are easing, and that confirms what a lot of businesses have already told us, that they still have problems, but they're not as bad as they were several months ago. So things are getting a little better, at least short term. I think we've had a peak. But as we go through next year, my expectation is that inflation is going to still be a problem. I think it's going to be at least 5%. It could be a lot higher.
And what are some of the key challenges, Bob, that you think we'll be facing in 2022?
Well, I think the challenge is going to continue to be a very sharp increase in spending in the economy. You know, when we came off of the lockdown, the spending rates went through the roof, just an enormous increase in spending. Now that's slowed down since the past summer, and spending is now going in an 8 to 10% annual rate. Now that's still very high, and unfortunately I think it's going to be at least that as we go through the coming year, and that's mainly because of what the Federal Reserve has done. They've simply created a lot of liquidity, a lot of money, and they're continuing to put more money into the system as we speak. So I think that that's going to mean that we will have strong spending throughout the course of this coming year.
Now, speaking of the Federal Reserve, Fed Chair Powell suggested the possibility of a recession. What are your thoughts?
It probably will take a downturn because the Fed has been so slow in acting. I mean, you know, we all know now that we've hit inflation, and the Fed admits there's maybe a year or 2 year lag between what they do and what happens to inflation. And the Fed hasn't even begun to apply monetary restraint. It probably won't do that until, I think, much later this year, because they tend to be behind the curve. So my expectation is we're going to continue to see challenges with respect to strong increases in spending, and that will last throughout this entire year.
Now, with the expected rate increases that Jerome Powell suggested that we're going to see over the next year. Do you anticipate this will affect the housing market, and if so, how?
Well, it depends on how much of a rate increase we get. And not even so much how much of a rate increase, but what its effect is on whether or not there's still going to be new money pouring into the economy. My judgment, I think the Fed is going to continue to move too slowly, and as a result of that, we're going to continue to see a lot of money come in and a lot of spending for this year. In terms of a recession, finally, the Fed will probably overreact because it'll appear as if nothing they do is going to contain inflation. And when that happens, the Fed usually raises rates enough to hurt the housing market and the economy. I don't expect them to do that until either late this year, maybe after the election is over, or at the beginning of next year. So I think we might have one more good year in terms of spending, but unfortunately, one more year in terms of pretty high inflation.
Bob Janetsky, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it.
House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy says he won't cooperate with the January 6th committee probing the breach of the U.S. Capitol. He accuses the committee of an abuse of power. The committee asked the California Republican to voluntarily hand over information. McCarthy says the committee's abuse of power stains the House of Representatives and will harm it going forward. He also says the 9-member panel is not conducting a legitimate investigation. The committee's chairman asked McCarthy in a letter to disclose his private conversations with former President Donald Trump. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi tells reporters Thursday that McCarthy has the obligation to cooperate with the committee.
Yes, I think he has an obligation, as we seek the truth, to help with that, but up to the committee as to what they do next.
The January 6th commission was created by the Democratic-led House during the summer of 2021 in a vote almost completely along party lines. With the Winter Olympics 3 weeks away, bipartisan lawmakers are concerned uniforms worn during the Games may be linked to forced labor. The Beijing Olympics is just around the corner. The problem is the Games are being hosted by a country with the worst human rights record on the planet. China human rights advocate Reggie Littlejohn is here to discuss. The Biden administration imposed their first ever sanctions over North Korea's weapons programs after the regime's recent missile tests. Hello and welcome back to NTD's Capital Report. The controversial Beijing Winter Olympics are only 3 weeks away. Human rights organizations and governments of several countries, including the U.S., have raised concerns over human rights abuses by the Chinese Communist regime. A group of bipartisan lawmakers are asking the International Olympic Committee to make sure that the uniforms used in the Games are not linked to forced labor. Key members of the Congressional Executive Commission on China penned a letter to express their concerns. They're asking for more information about the IOC's contracts with 2 Chinese companies that use cotton produced in the Xinjiang region. The lawmakers wrote that cotton produced in Xinjiang is, quote, synonymous with forced labor and the systematic repression that takes place there. Last month, the president signed a law banning imports from Xinjiang unless companies can prove the products were not made with forced labor. With the Beijing Olympics just around the corner and the CCP virus raging throughout China, we sat down with a prominent voice when it comes to human rights in China, Reggie Littlejohn. Here's a look. Reggie Littlejohn, thank you so much for joining us in the Capital Report.
Oh, thank you so very much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Reggie, you've been very outspoken leading up to the Beijing Olympics, 2022 Olympic Games here. There's a recent call from you calling for the protection of U.S. Olympians. Tell us exactly what you mean by that.
So there are 2 elements to this issue about the protection of the athletes. One is that there's a health crisis going on in China right now, where China is locking down, I think they have 20 million people locked down right now because of a coronavirus outbreak. They also are suffering an outbreak from hemorrhagic fever. And some of these places that have the coronavirus lockdown are right next to Beijing. So there's a health issue. The second issue is that when the athletes go into that Olympic village, they are going to be under complete surveillance.
It's a very interesting point you raise. On that issue about talking about human rights in China, how does it make you feel when you see these household names on NBC, who is the sponsor of the Olympics, promoting the Olympics with very little to no talk about these exact issues that you just mentioned?
I feel like our society has lost its moral compass in some ways, and I like to take as an example Mr. Enes Kanter Freedom, who has done the opposite. So he is a basketball player with Boston Celtics, and he has taken a strong stand calling out Beijing, calling out other athletes, asking them to stand up. And he stands to suffer also just in his career. And he only has a one-year contract. They could choose to not renew his contract. But he is going to stand because he says it's more important to be able to sleep at night, to know that he's doing the right thing than it is to play basketball.
Now, when it comes to, NBC, these are journalists. These are mainstream American journalists. Do you think by not mentioning human rights issues that it somehow emboldens the CCP and legitimizes Xi Jinping?
Oh, it absolutely does. When the Chinese Communist Party commits heinous and hideous human rights atrocities like forced abortion, forced sterilization, systematic rape, interning millions of Uyghurs in what amounts to concentration camps, forced labor, and people just don't say anything. And not only do they not say anything, they actually promote this extremely prestigious international event that is going to be a way for the Chinese Communist Party to have, a propaganda gold mine. There's responsibility. To me, knowledge implies responsibility. It's hard for me to imagine that these journalists and business leaders don't know what's going on.
What do you think it's going to take for these corporate conglomerates to come to terms that the CCP is not an entity that responsible citizens throughout the world should be interacting and dealing with?
Number one, since they agreed to sponsor the games, it came out officially that China is committing genocide, and they could say, "Oh my gosh, this is new information. We can withdraw." They could do that. And number two, what does it mean to stand with the athletes? I'll tell you what it would mean to me. If I were an athlete, I would have wanted to see the games be moved. The games were delayed for a year because of coronavirus, the Tokyo Games. I don't see any reason that the Beijing Games can't be delayed a year because of genocide and moved so the athletes don't have to be surveilled and they don't have to be competing on soil that is stained with the blood of genocide.
Reggie Littlejohn, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Senator Marco Rubio is sending a letter to President Biden asking him what steps his administration has taken to ensure that the U.S. Olympic athletes are sufficiently protected from Beijing's surveillance and manipulation. The senator's office is raising concerns about U.S. athletes using the Chinese regime's digital currency. Beijing is pushing for visitors and major U.S. credit card companies to use the currency during the Winter Games. It requires users to download a software for transactions. In the letter, the senator said that the threat this poses to Americans is enormous because the software is likely to be harmful. Chinese software and spyware have long been known for collecting information from Americans. The Pentagon's Inspector General this month launched an investigation into how the military screens recruits. According to a Pentagon memo, the audit will start January 22nd. It will determine if military applicants are being adequately screened for, quote, supremacist, extremist, and criminal gang behavior. The audit comes as a follow-up to new military institute training and guidance. The department announced the new guidance after active duty members were found to have participated in the January 6th Capitol breach. But some criticized the guidance as an intent to drive political and social conservatives out of the military. The Biden administration on Wednesday imposed its first sanctions over North Korea's weapons programs. This is after a series of missile tests by Pyongyang, including 2 since last week. Secretary of State Antony Blinken calls these tests profoundly destabilizing. Secretary Blinken talked about his concerns of North Korea's recent missile tests during an interview with MSNBC.
In recent weeks has been renewed missile tests, something that is profoundly destabilizing, it's dangerous, and it contravenes a whole host of UN Security Council resolutions.
The sanctions by the Treasury Department target 6 North Korean individuals, 1 Russian individual, and 1 Russian firm. 4 of those North Koreans are based in China. The U.S. is accusing them of procuring goods for the weapons programs from China and Russia.
This is about our ongoing efforts to prevent the advancement of the DPRK's WMD and ballistic missile programs and to follow.
The U.S. proposes that 5 of those individuals also be blacklisted by the UN Security Council, but it will require a consensus by the 15-member North Korea Sanctions Committee. Russia and China are both on that committee, and Beijing has openly opposed U.S. sanctions. Since taking office last year, the Biden administration has sought unsuccessfully to engage in dialogue with North Korea and make it give up its nuclear and missiles programs. But the State Department says the U.S. remains committed to pursuing diplomacy with Pyongyang. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is urging the Biden administration to do more than just sanctions and take the threat of a major war on the European continent seriously.
As we speak, Russia is literally preparing to escalate its military assault on Ukraine. It has amassed more than 100,000 troops on Ukraine's border. It will take urgency and seriousness from the administration. Time is of the essence. Our delays in getting emergency assistance to Ukraine approved do not inspire much confidence. The administration cannot move at the speed of bureaucracy.
The Pretrial Services Agency is a small federal agency, and they are announcing a new rule related to their COVID-19 vaccine mandate. A public notice this week says workers who seek religious exemptions will be added to a list. The notice did not say why the agency needs to create the list. Most federal employees' requests for religious exemptions have so far been denied. According to analysts from the Heritage Foundation, the Pretrial Services Agency is being used in a test. There may eventually be an effort to create a database of employees with religious beliefs across the federal government. That's all we have for you on the Capitol Report today. Thank you for joining us. I'm Steve Lance, and we'll be back tomorrow with more of the latest news direct to you from our nation's capital. Thank you for tuning in, and have a great evening.